These are the slides for Chapter 4, Rule Britannia. By the time we get to 1707, we start to refer to the nation of Britain, and that's because there was a union of England and Scotland in 1707, though that was challenged in the 1740s with the Jacobite Rebellion in Scotland. But as we start the early part of the 18th century, the early 1700s, there's about 250,000 people of British descent or who are British in British North America. By the time we get to 1750, that has quadrupled to about 1 million people. And as a result, the ties between Great Britain and America grow stronger and are exceptionally strong only a couple of decades before the American Revolution actually began. This chapter in your text is reflective of a book that was popular in the late 1980s by David Hackett Fisher called Albion Seed: The Four British Folkways into America. And so those four British folkways start with the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay between 1630 and 1641, about 20,000. They're primarily from East Anglia, the southeastern part of England, in areas like Norfolk and Ipswich. And then the second major group from southwest England, centered around the city of Bristol, would be the Royalist Cavaliers. Those were the English who supported the King Charles, during the English Civil War. And so they primarily came to Virginia. And then the third group would be the Quakers, who settled primarily in Pennsylvania, but also in Delaware. Pennsylvania was named after their leader, William Penn. About 3,000 Quakers came from the North Midlands of England in the 1680s, and that's why Pennsylvania was a. We previously discussed that New Netherland, which is now New York, was established by the Dutch in the 1600s. By the time we get to 1664, Charles II was convinced by his closest advisors, the Lords Proprietors, to go after the colony because it was a valuable colony. And so there really was not any fighting. The Dutch recognized they didn't have the strength to fight off the English, so they basically reached a settlement where the Dutch were able to keep their property there. And so the colony is renamed by Charles after his younger brother James II, who was later James II, who was the Duke of York, so it becomes New York. And so by 1700s, you had really a diverse population in New York, with the Dutch who had originally settled, the English who were coming in, and then French Huguenots who had also settled there in New York as well. We discussed the fact that one of the British folkways related to the large number of Quakers who came from the British Midlands. The Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, were referred to as Quakers because of their suggestion that people should tremble at the word of the Lord. And they were different from other religious groups in that they were much more open and tolerant of other people, other religious groups, and especially they were tolerant of American Indians. But their leader, William Penn, wanted to launch a holy experiment, a land where people would be invited, but he also wanted to get wealthy. One reason why the Quakers were so tolerant of other groups is they believed that the Holy Spirit, what they refer to as the inner light, could inspire every soul. They were also pacifists in general, and so they had good relations with American Indians. William Penn was also known for establishing the frame of government, which was in essence, one of the first constitutions in the New World, although it basically provided for a very strong governor, who, not surprisingly, was William Penn, and a weak legislature as the form of government there. While Penn believed in religious toleration, he was not a supporter of democracy, did not believe that the landless or the poor should have a say in government. But Philadelphia became a very important port city in the New World, and as I mentioned previously, the population of Pennsylvania grew very rapidly. So by the time we get to 1700, only 20 years or so after the establishment of Pennsylvania, it is the third most populous colony, behind only Virginia and Massachusetts. Penn was only there for 4 years, And then eventually the Quaker influence over the colony started to recede because of various theological disagreements within the church itself. Now, during this time period, there were a lot of pressures on the colonies. Really, this had been ongoing for over throughout the 17th and into the 18th centuries. We've discussed before the idea of mercantilism, the pursuit of wealth through the acquisition of gold and having a positive trade balance. Um, so there was dependence then on the colonies to help create that positive trade balance, so much so that back in 1651, the Navigation Act, which was passed during the time in which Cromwell was in power, required all goods imported to England or other colonies to be carried only on English ships. There was this real concern that the British, the English at that point, wanted to maintain control over colonial trade because the most valuable aspect of the colonies to the English was not for security purposes, but was for trade purposes. The Navigation Act of 1660 added what was known as the enumerated products, or the list of products that were only to be shipped to England or its colonies, and could not be shipped to the French or to the Spanish. And that would include things like tobacco, cotton, indigo, sugar, and later rice and furs. In other words, those crops that were very valuable from an economic perspective had to go to other colonies or back to England. They could not go to foreign countries. The British Crown also reserved the right to nullify any colonial legislation, though we'll see they didn't really uh, impose that right very often. And as a result of these controls, though, the colonies did not believe they could fully develop economically. But Britain did, the British were kind of lax about things, and so that policy was known as salutary neglect, where they did not strictly enforce regulations through the early part of the 1700s. But when they start to enforce these regulations as we get further along into the 18th century, as we get to the mid 1700s, for example, that's going to create a lot of tension between the colonies and the British Crown. So real quickly, I want to mention something that occurred back in England. That's the Glorious Revolution. So Charles II, the older son of Charles I, died in 1685, and then his brother James II became king. This became problematic because James II had a Catholic wife and favored his young Catholic son to be heir to the throne over his older Protestant daughters, who were known as Mary and Anne. So, as a result of this, Catholics were on the ascendancy in England and also in the colonies. So in 1686, James II created a forced union of colonies in New England known the Dominion of New England in order to centralize colonial governments there. The colonists were very upset about the imposition of rule from England, and you can imagine the New Englanders, who were many of whom were Puritans, who had helped bring about the end back in England, the end of King Charles I, and had been the enemies of the king, and certainly very anti-Catholic, were angry about this imposition of this rule. There was a very harsh ruler there named Sir Edmund Andros. He even took control of Puritan churches, turned them into Anglican parishes that the Puritans thought were very close to being Catholic anyway. He also strictly enforced the Navigation Acts. So all this was going on, but the Whigs, back in England, the classic Liberal Party that favored the expansion of individual liberties over the Tories, the opposing party, worked to depose James II. They actually invited his older daughter Mary, who was married to a Dutchman by the name of William of Orange, a Dutch royalist, and invited Mary and her husband William, hence William and Mary, to land in Britain to claim the crown in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes it's referred to as a bloodless revolution. That's not entirely accurate, but essentially you had a large group of English inviting an English and Dutch leader into the country to depose the father of Mary, James. So James fled to France. And then when this happened, the Boston settlers in Massachusetts overthrew Anderson, ended the Dominion of New England. But this end of James as a ruler, and the fact that his Catholic son never became ruler, that's going to lead to that uprising by the Scottish, who want to restore the descendants of James to the throne in 1745, known as the Jacobite Rebellion. So this something that happens in the 1680s is going to lead to another rebellion in 1745 and tensions between the English and Scottish that will lead to an end of many of the Scottish cultural aspects, like including the end of clans and the wearing of tartan kilts and things along those lines. So in return for the parliamentary support, William and Mary reaches an agreement with Parliament to the Bill of Rights in 1689, which created a constitutional monarchy. Now, this is different from the written Bill of Rights that we have in the U.S. Constitution that we'll talk about later. And of course, around this time period, the second college in America is created. Harvard was created in the 1630s, but it's here in Virginia. And of course, you may be familiar with the college. It was called the College of William and Mary because named after the new leaders of England. During this time period, we also had the Englishman John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises of government, that he argued those who govern do so with the consent of the people. That's known as a social contract theory. That's going to be very important. You'll see when we get to the Declaration of Independence, a lot of the language in that is really based on writings of John Locke. They also passed the English Toleration Act in 1689, which provided more religious freedom to non-conforming Protestants. So whether you were Anglican or whether you were Puritan, you had more religious liberties. However, that did not expand to Catholics at that time. So we'll even see as we get close to the American Revolution that here in America there was a lot of anti-Catholicism as we get close to the mid-1750s into the 1760s. So in 1660, the England's Royal African Company began to trade slaves, and between 1672 to 1713, so we're talking about a period of 40 years or so, about 125,000 slaves were brought by the company from Africa to the Americas, and about 20% of those died during that horrific Middle Passage that we talked about, that journey from Africa to America. And after the Glorious Revolutions, more merchants became involved in the slave trade, primarily because it was so profitable to do so. For those who were enslaved, the primary response was to cling to families, even though families often were separated, and to African customs. And so this is going to have a big cultural impact here in America, especially in the southern part of America, as African culture eventually becomes part of the American way of life. Slave rebellions occurred frequently. There was a very prominent one in South Carolina called the Stono Rebellion that occurred near Charleston. As a response to that, South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, which prohibited slaves from gathering, learning to write, or traveling freely. In other words, there was a huge crackdown out of the fear in South Carolina, with the majority of the population being slaves. Fires in New York City led to rumors of a massive slave rebellion and a Catholic conspiracy. Again, today is not the first time that we've had conspiracy theories take hold in America. There was no truth to these rumors that happened with the fires. Fires were not uncommon. In fact, in the 1800s, fires are a real problem when you have structures in cities that are built of wood. It doesn't take much for fires to occur and for those fires to spread. The New York conspiracy trials that followed these fires resulted in the execution of 13 slaves who were burned at the stakes and 4 whites who were hanged, even though there's really no evidence that they were in any way involved with those fires. So in America, there was a interesting approach to religion. There was a lot of diversity by the time we get into the 1700s in some areas, less so in other areas. For example, in New England, primarily people still were Puritan, at that point known as the Congregationalists. That was the dominant religion. That was not the case in Rhode Island, which had a lot of religious liberty. In the South, the primary religious denomination was the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. That was especially the case in Virginia and the Carolinas, though parishes were spread extremely thin because populations were spread out. In addition, in the South, the Anglican Church often had to be in contest with planters for control of the local parishes. Um, there were other denominations at that point that were still small, such as the Presbyterians, which was essentially the Church of Scotland, also a Calvinist denomination like the Congregationalists. There were some Baptists and Methodists, when the Methodists were an offshoot of the Anglicans. They were established in the South. And again, with Pennsylvania being a colony that embraced religious freedom and diversity, there was no dominant denomination in the middle colonies, especially as the Quakers had struggled with their own sort of religious issues. So as we get into the 1730s, we have what's known as the First Great Awakening in America. It started in Scotland, but then spread to the middle colonies. Now, we'll have a second Great Awakening by the time we get into the late 1790s and early 1800s, but the First Great Awakening occurs in the 1730s. It emphasized the personal and spiritual aspects of religion over the doctrine and scriptural study. And the reason for this is that I mentioned John Locke. There was a spread of reasoning and rationalism, and there was concern by some religious leaders that there was too much intellectual intellectual aspects to religious participation, and um, uh, not enough spiritual aspects to it. And so that's why these folks believe that basically as a counter to rationalism and reason, that there should be a more spiritual component. So that's why it emphasizes the personal and spiritual aspects of religion. Some of the leaders of the movement included George Whitefield, uh, who was actually from Britain, but perhaps the most significant leader here in America was a man named Jonathan Edwards, who famously authored the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Theodore Frelinghuysen of the Dutch Reformed Church. By the way, that name Frelinghuysen, there have been several members of Congress, including one within the last decade or so, named Frelinghuysen, descended from that family in the middle colonies or mid-Atlantic states like New Jersey. And then Samuel Davis, who was a Presbyterian. But there was a lot of charismatic preaching and a lot large audiences that became involved as a response of the First Great Awakening. And really, it focused on those who were already Christian as opposed to uh, seeking converts, but just wanted to change the way people worshiped. Now, within that, there were some Christians who were opposed to the form of worship that comes out in the Great Awakening. Those who preferred the more formalistic, traditional style of worship were known as the Old Lights, whereas the New Lights really embraced this evangelistic approach. So there was a lot of conflict between these different groups. So this was the first major religious movement in America. Again, as I mentioned, less than 60 or 70 years later, we start to have the second Great Awakening, which will have a big impact on the denominations that are prominent in America. Some of those denominations that were smaller, like the Baptists and Methodists, then become the leading denominations of Protestant Christianity in America. One of the things that led to the sort of backlash against that led it to the First Great Awakening was its backlash against this rational intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment really focused on new ideas of reason over superstition and science over blind faith, and so some Christians took that as an attack on their faith. But there were new ideas that emerged about scientific investigation and religious tolerance, and rationalism and empiricism, the ability to prove things by a structured process, became important ideas. There were groups that emerged really almost replacing traditional religion with their focus on reason, and that included a fraternal society that's still around today, the Freemasons. Because of the secretive aspect of the Masons, there was a lot of criticism of that group, and we'll see in the 1800s even a political party emerges just based on its opposition to Freemasonry. Deism, or deism, pronounced both ways, was a popular Enlightenment belief that the divine is creator, but as the divine not really interested in controlling what happens among humanity. This becomes a popular belief, and many of our early political leaders really, more so than necessarily being traditional Christians, really kind of lean towards this idea of embracing a divine creator, but not necessarily traditional Christian ideas. But personal morality was considered important, as was the practice of good works, rather than abiding by a strict moral code. We've discussed some other colonies. Georgia was one of the last of the original 13 colonies established, um, in part as a defensive mechanism against the Spanish from Florida. It was really offered as a haven, or not necessarily voluntarily, for English debtors. They were pushed towards Georgia to serve as a buffer between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida. It was named after King George II, and its primary leader, who was a strong individual, was James Oglethorpe. Now, initially, Georgia embraced all men as being equal, called for alcohol and slavery to be banned. However, from an economic perspective, they realized within 15 to 17 years the need for slave labor to help rice grow as a cash crop, and this led to the establishment of slavery in Georgia. There were many wars fought between the British and French between 1689 and 1763. In most of these wars, the fighting actually occurred between American Indian tribes serving as proxies for the two nations, and just about, at least in the colonies. Most of these wars started in Europe. That's where the real fighting occurred between France and Britain. But here in America, it was the Indian tribes representing their different nations with whom they were aligned that did most of the fighting. That changes when we get to the 1750s and we have the French and Indian War. The colonists were very concerned with French land ambitions in North America. The Ohio Valley was an area that the colonists really wanted desperately because it was a rich agricultural area, and they wanted to expand. Meanwhile, the French wanted to control the Ohio Valley so they could link New France and what is today Canada with the lower Mississippi Valley. So they started to build forts in the disputed land areas. And George Washington and a group of Virginia militiamen actually fired on French troops in what is today western Pennsylvania at Great Meadows. And the Indian allies of the Virginians actually committed some atrocities, killed some of the French. That led to a desire for the French to get back at Washington and the Virginians, and they defeated them at Fort Necessity, a hastily built fort that earned its name. And so that was really the beginning of the French and Indian War. And what was different about this war from all the other wars fought in the 1700s between France and Britain is this was the first war that actually began in North America instead of in Europe, and it spread to Europe, and not just Europe, but other parts of the world. It was essentially a world war known as the 7 Years' War. And I say world war because there was actually fighting in places like India and Egypt. So it becomes just another massive conflict between the French and the British, and it's going to have significant implications on the fact that the American colonists, within 20 years, even though actually check that within 12 years of being aligned with the British, are then willing to go to war against the British. Because of the fighting overseas, the French really didn't put a lot of effort into this war. Again, involved heavily American Indian tribes. But this was the first time in which the colonists were fighting together against a common enemy. Now, they were not fighting by themselves. They had British soldiers here who were their allies. Remember, were still British colonies here in America, so the Americans and the British fought against the French, along with Indian tribes who were aligned with the British and the Americans against Indian tribes, the majority of whom were aligned with the French. This resulted in the first Intercolonial Congress, which did not include all of the colonies, but it did include several, and there Ben Franklin helped create a call for a plan of union. it should be that should say called for a plan of union with the colonial legislature. Now, it was rejected or ignored by colonies, but that's the first time that there's any discussion about a union of colonists. During the war, the Acadians in the region of Arcadia in eastern Canada, which is now Nova Scotia, were expelled from Acadia. It then was renamed by the British as Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland in Latin. The Acadians were forced to march essentially down to join other French settlements all the way down into the mouth of the Mississippi. And from there, we get the term Cajun, comes from the Acadians. And if you ever have read the poem Evangeline by Henry Longfellow, it talks about this forced march. The war did not go well initially for the British and Americans, and Braddock was a very poor general. He was actually killed. But back in England, the parliamentarian William Pitt rallied the war effort, and the major battle was the Battle of Quebec, in which both leaders, both Wolfe and Montcalm, who led the French, were killed on the cliffs of the Plains of Abraham near modern-day Quebec City. But the British won. It was a significant victory, and eventually this world war ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, a British victory, and of course a colonial victory, therefore, over the French. Now, the most significant aspect of this, the consequences of the conflict, well, the biggest one is it greatly added to British financial debt, and as a result, the British are going to turn to a variety of taxes on the American colonies to help recoup their financial losses, and that's going to lead to a significant increase in tension. As I mentioned, the American colonists in 12 years are going to go from fighting alongside the British to actually fighting against the British. In addition, it shattered the myth of British invincibility. The British were supposed to be the greatest military in the world, yet American colonists who fought along beside them realized that they bled and died like any other people did as well. On the opposite end of that, it increased the confidence of colonists who were actually involved in their first war against a European power. It increased the unity of colonists, as we saw the Albany Plan of Union. And this one is a little maybe softer consequence, but colonists were angered by the British arrogance, while the British were angered by the colonial efforts to profit from the conflict. Some American colonists tried to make money off the war. And the last one, again, is a soft one, the idea that the French wanted to get back at the British. But again, we're talking about two countries who had fought several times throughout the 1700s, but that's certainly going to help the Americans to be able to generate French support when they fight the British in the American Revolution. So that's it for Chapter 4.